When did you realize the person everyone warned you about was actually trying to protect you? I was 12 when Marcus moved in next door. The whole neighborhood buzzed with whispers within hours. That's the man from the news, Mrs. Henderson said, clutching her pearls like they could protect her from whatever evil she imagined. The one who went to prison. Mom grabbed my arm that first evening as I headed outside to ride my bike. Her fingers dug into my skin hard enough to leave marks that would still be there the next morning. Stay away from that house, she said, her voice sharp with a fear I'd never heard before. That man is dangerous. He hurt children. I wanted to ask how she knew, what exactly he'd done, why someone dangerous would be allowed to live in our neighborhood. But the look in her eyes stopped me cold. This wasn't up for discussion. For weeks, I watched him through my bedroom window. He kept to himself, tending a small garden that was actually quite beautiful. Tomatoes and sunflowers, mostly, arranged in neat rows with little handwritten labels stuck into the soil. He never made eye contact with anyone, never waved back when kids rode past. When children appeared on bikes, parents would immediately call them back inside, their voices sharp with panic. The mailman wouldn't even walk up his driveway. He'd throw packages from the sidewalk and hurry away like the house itself was contaminated. Mrs. Patterson from across the street started a phone tree, calling every parent whenever Marcus left his house. He's headed toward the school, she'd whisper into the receiver. Better keep the kids inside today. The Homeowners Association held an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. I wasn't supposed to know about it, but I heard Mom on the phone with Mrs. Chen, their voices low and worried. We've contacted a lawyer, Mom said. There has to be something we can do, some way to get him out of here. But apparently there wasn't. Marcus had served his time, whatever that time had been for. He had every legal right to live wherever he wanted, even if that somewhere was right next door to families with children. But I noticed things others didn't. Little things that made me question everything the adults were saying, like how he'd leave his porch light on until exactly 4:15 p.m. every weekday, which was precisely when I got home from school, even though he worked nights at the warehouse. I'd see him watching from his kitchen window as I walked up our driveway, and only then would the light click off. How he'd suddenly appear to water his plants whenever the Parker boys followed me down our street, and they'd mysteriously decide to take a different route home. At first, I thought it was coincidence, but it happened too many times to be random. How his curtains would twitch whenever I walked past, like he was keeping watch. Not in a creepy way, more like a guard dog checking for threats. I started paying attention to his routine. Every morning at 7:30 a.m., he'd leave for his night shift at Morrison's warehouse, dressed in a simple blue uniform with his name embroidered on the pocket. He drove a beat-up Honda Civic that looked like it had seen better decades. He'd return at 6 a.m., park in his driveway, and go straight inside without looking around. On weekends, he'd work in his garden, but the moment children appeared outside, he'd pack up his tools and disappear. If a kid's ball rolled into his yard, he'd throw it back over the fence without coming outside. When Girl Scouts came selling cookies, he'd leave money in an envelope taped to his door with a note saying to keep the change. It was like he was trying to be invisible. Mrs. Henderson organized what she called safety patrols, parents taking turns walking the neighborhood, keeping an eye on Marcus's house. They'd write down when he left, when he returned, who visited him, no one ever did, what packages he received. We need to document everything, she announced at the next homeowners meeting, in case something happens. But what struck me was how hard Marcus worked to avoid giving them anything to document. He never lingered outside, never spoke to neighbors unless directly addressed, and even then his responses were brief and polite. Never played music loud enough to hear. Never had parties or visitors. If he was a predator, he was the most antisocial predator I'd ever heard of. One evening in October, I was walking home late from the library when 3 older boys cornered me behind the gas station. Jake Morrison and his friends, the same ones who'd been making my life hell since middle school started. Look what we got here, Jake sneered, shoving me against the brick wall hard enough to scrape my shoulders. Little bookworms all alone. Jake was the kind of kid who'd been held back twice and was already shaving in 7th grade. His friends, Tyler and Brett, were smaller but mean in that pack animal way that made them dangerous. They went through my backpack, laughing as my books scattered across the dirty pavement. One of them grabbed my math homework, the assignment I'd spent 3 hours perfecting, and tore it in half. Another kicked my water bottle, sending it rolling into the gutter, where it landed in a puddle of something that smelled like rotting food. Please, I said, hating how my voice cracked. Just leave me alone. Ah, little baby's gonna cry, Jake taunted, shoving me harder against the wall. The rough brick caught my jacket and tore a hole near the shoulder. Maybe we should teach you some manners. Show you what happens to freaks who think they're better than everyone else. Tyler pulled out his phone and started recording. This is gonna be great, he laughed. We can put it online. Show everyone what a loser you are. I closed my eyes, wishing I could disappear. Mom was going to kill me for coming home late. The librarian had warned us about walking alone after dark. I should have called for a ride. Should have asked someone to walk with me. Should have done anything except put myself in this situation. That's when Marcus appeared. He didn't run or shout or announce himself dramatically. He just stepped out from behind the dumpster where he must have been taking out trash from the Chinese restaurant and asked quietly, "Problem here?" His voice was calm, almost conversational, but something about it made the hair on my arms stand up. He wasn't a big man, maybe average height, lean build, the kind of person you wouldn't notice in a crowd. But the way he stood, the way he looked at the boys without blinking, suggested someone you really didn't want to mess with. The boys looked up, and I watched recognition flash across their faces. Jake's cocky grin disappeared instantly. His friends took a step back, suddenly looking very young and very scared. "No problem, mister," Jake stammered, his voice completely different from the confident bully tone he'd been using seconds earlier. "We were just leaving," Marcus said, his voice still calm but carrying an edge that made even me nervous. "Yeah," Tyler agreed quickly, stuffing his phone back in his pocket. "We were just leaving." Within seconds, all three of them were gone, leaving my things scattered everywhere and me standing there shaking. Marcus knelt down and helped me collect my books. Up close, I could see the deep sadness in his eyes, lines around them that spoke of sleepless nights and old pain. His hands were gentle as he straightened the pages of my torn notebook, careful not to make the damage worse. "You okay?" he asked, handing me my backpack. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "They hurt you?" I shook my head. The brick wall had scraped my shoulders, but that was nothing compared to what might have happened if he hadn't shown up. "Good." He stood up, brushing dirt off his knees. "You should get home. It's getting dark." "Thank you," I whispered. He nodded but didn't smile, just turned and walked back toward the dumpster, shoulders hunched like he was carrying the weight of the world. I made it home just as Mom was starting dinner. She took one look at my torn jacket and the scrapes on my hands and immediately launched into protective parent mode. "What happened? Are you hurt? Where have you been?" I told her about staying late at the library, about the boys cornering me, about someone scaring them away. I didn't mention who that someone was. "This is exactly why I don't want you walking alone after dark," she said, dabbing antiseptic on my scraped palms. "There are dangerous people out there." The irony wasn't lost on me. The dangerous person everyone warned me about had just saved me from actual danger. The next day, Mom was waiting when I got back from school. Her face was white with fury, and I knew immediately that someone had seen me with Marcus. "Mrs. Chen saw you talking to him," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. "I specifically told you to stay away from that monster." "But Mom, he just helped me. Don't you dare defend him," she snapped, and I was shocked by the venom in her voice. Mom rarely raised her voice. "Never use that tone with me. Do you have any idea what kind of man he is? What he did to children before he went to prison?" I tried to explain about the bullies, about how Marcus had just been taking out trash and happened to be there, about how he'd never even really talked to me. But Mom wasn't listening. She was already grabbing her keys. "We're going to see Pastor Williams," she announced. "Right now." The drive to the church was silent and tense. Mom's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and she kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror like I might disappear. Pastor Williams met us in his office, which was decorated with crosses of every size and material, family photos showing 3 generations of smiling people, and motivational posters with Bible verses in flowing script. He was a kind man in his 60s, who'd baptized me as a baby and had always treated me like one of his own grandchildren. But today, his expression was serious as he sat me down and spoke in careful, measured words about dangerous people and how they operated. "Predators are smart, Emma," he said, leaning forward with his hands clasped on his desk. "They don't look like the monsters in movies. They look like friendly neighbors, helpful teachers, respected community members. They pretend to be kind to gain children's trust." He pulled out a pamphlet from his desk drawer, one of those educational materials with pictures of smiling adults talking to children, designed to teach kids about stranger danger. "They study kids' routines," he continued, pointing to illustrations that suddenly seemed more sinister than educational. "They learn their vulnerabilities, find ways to seem helpful. They position themselves as rescuers so children will trust them." "But he didn't offer me anything," I protested. "He just scared away some bullies and told me to go home." Pastor Williams nodded gravely, like this was exactly what he'd expected me to say. "That's precisely what I'm talking about. He positioned himself as your rescuer so you'd feel grateful to him. Trust him. Next time, he might offer to walk you home for safety, then maybe invite you inside for a snack or to use the bathroom." He opened the pamphlet to a page showing the progression of predatory behavior. The slow escalation from helpful stranger to dangerous situation. "That's how these men operate, sweetheart. They're patient. They build relationships slowly. They make children feel special, chosen, protected." Mom squeezed my shoulder, her grip tight enough to hurt. "This is why you need to report any contact immediately, before you become his next victim." I nodded and promised to stay away, but something didn't add up in my 12-year-old brain. If Marcus was hunting for victims, why did he avoid children completely? I'd been watching him for weeks, and I'd never seen him try to talk to any kid in the neighborhood. When the elementary school bus stopped at our corner every morning, he'd retreat inside his house until it left. When parents walked by with strollers, he'd turn away or find something to do in his backyard. If children's toys ended up in his yard, he'd throw them back over the fence without coming outside. For someone supposedly targeting kids, he sure went to a lot of trouble to avoid them. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with watching Marcus. Not because I wanted to talk to him. Mom had made her position on that crystal clear, but because I was trying to understand the disconnect between what adults were telling me and what I was seeing with my own eyes. I started keeping a notebook, documenting everything I observed. My scientific approach to the situation would have made my science teacher proud if I'd been studying anything other than our neighbor's daily routine. Every morning at 7:30 a.m. sharp, he'd leave for his night shift at Morrison's warehouse, dressed in that same blue uniform with Marcus embroidered on the pocket. The warehouse was on the other side of town, past the industrial district where most kids never went. He'd return at 6 a.m. looking tired, park his beat-up Honda in the driveway, and go straight inside without looking around or lingering. On weekends, he'd work in his garden, and this was where his behavior got really interesting. He'd positioned his small vegetable plot so he had a clear view of the bus stop where elementary kids waited each morning, but also so he could retreat quickly if any of them approached. I watched him plant tomatoes, sunflowers, green beans, and herbs in neat rows with little handwritten labels. His garden was beautiful, clearly the work of someone who cared about growing things properly. But the moment children appeared outside, he'd pack up his tools and disappear inside. It was starting to feel less like stalking behavior and more like protection. One Saturday morning, I decided to test my theory. Instead of staying inside like Mom preferred, I sat on our front porch with a book, clearly visible from Marcus's yard. Sure enough, within minutes of settling into the porch swing, I saw his curtains twitch. But he didn't come outside, didn't try to talk to me, didn't even wave. Instead, he stayed at his window, and I realized he was watching the street. When a white van I didn't recognize drove slowly past our house, Marcus moved to a different window to keep it in sight. When it turned around and came back, he stepped onto his porch. The van kept driving, but Marcus stayed outside for another 10 minutes, watching. When I told Mom about the van, she was immediately concerned. What kind of van? Did you see who was driving? But when I mentioned that Marcus had been watching it too, her expression changed. He was probably the one driving it earlier, she said dismissively. Predators often case neighborhoods, looking for opportunities. That didn't make sense to me. If Marcus was casing our neighborhood, why would he then stand on his porch to scare himself away? I started paying more attention to the details Mom and other adults seemed to miss or dismiss, like how Marcus had installed motion sensor lights around his property, not just for his own protection, but positioned to illuminate the street in front of our house and the Chen's house next door. How he'd started parking his car in his driveway instead of his garage, creating a clearer line of sight to the street. How he'd trimmed the hedge between our properties so it wouldn't block his view of our front door. If I didn't know better, I'd think he was setting up a security system to protect the neighborhood. One afternoon, I decided to test my theory more directly. Instead of walking straight home from school, I took a detour through Riverside Park where older kids sometimes hung out smoking cigarettes and causing trouble. It was risky. Mom had specifically forbidden me from going there alone, but I needed to know if my suspicions were correct. Sure enough, Jake Morrison and his crew were there, sprawled on the picnic tables near the basketball court. They spotted me immediately. Well, Jake called out, flicking his cigarette toward me, if it isn't our little friend. I tried to keep walking, but they surrounded me, blocking the path back to the street. My heart was pounding, but I kept my expression neutral. If my theory was right, if Marcus was really watching over our neighborhood, "You look scared," Brett observed, grinning in that mean way that made my skin crawl. "Maybe we should walk you home. Make sure you're safe." They started closing in, and I genuinely began to panic. What if I was wrong? What if Marcus really was a predator, and I just put myself in danger to prove some stupid point? What if he wasn't even watching? Wasn't even aware I was here? Yeah, Tyler agreed, pulling out his phone again. "We should definitely make sure you get home safe. Wouldn't want anything bad to happen to you." The way he said it made it clear that bad things were exactly what he had in mind. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. "There's my neighbor," Marcus said casually, like we were old friends who'd planned to meet at the park. "Ready to head home, Emma?" Jake and his friends immediately backed off. They didn't run this time, but they moved away from me, suddenly very interested in their cigarettes and phones. Yeah, I managed, my voice only shaking a little. "Ready." Marcus walked beside me in comfortable silence until we reached the edge of the park. Then he stopped. "That was reckless," he said quietly without looking at me. "You put yourself in danger to see if I'd show up." I stared at him in shock. "How did you—" "I know what it looks like when someone's testing boundaries," he said, finally meeting my eyes. "I've seen it before. Don't do it again. Those boys are more dangerous than you realize. How did you know I was there?" "I didn't. I was walking to the store and heard voices. Recognized yours." He started to walk away, then turned back. "And Emma? Next time you want to know something about me, just ask. Don't put yourself at risk for answers." That night, I lay in bed thinking about his words. How had he known I was testing him? And why did he seem more concerned about my safety than angry about being watched? I decided to take his advice. The next Saturday, I found him in his garden and approached the fence between our yards. He looked up from weeding his tomato plants, surprised but not unwelcoming. "You said I could ask," I said, gripping the chain-link fence between us. He set down his small shovel and gave me his full attention. Up close, I could see that his eyes weren't just sad. They were haunted, like someone who'd seen things he wished he could forget. "Why does everyone think you hurt children?" His face went very still. For a long moment, he didn't answer. I could hear birds chirping, a dog barking somewhere down the street, the distant sound of someone mowing their lawn. Then he sighed deeply, like he was releasing a breath he'd been holding for years. "Because I did hurt someone," he said finally. "Just not the way people think." Before I could ask what he meant, Mom's voice cut across the yard like a whip. "Emma Marie Johnson, get away from that fence right now." She was standing on our porch, phone in hand, looking ready to call 911. I started. "Inside. Now." The tone of her voice told me this wasn't up for discussion. That evening, Mom sat me down for the most serious conversation of my life. She'd called Pastor Williams, who'd called someone at the police station, who'd reminded her of Marcus's parole restrictions. Apparently, talking to minors was a violation that could send him back to prison. "Do you understand what you've done?" Mom asked, her voice thick with worry and anger. "You could have sent him back to prison. And worse, you could have put yourself in terrible danger." "But he didn't do anything wrong," I protested. "He just answered my question." "That's not the point," Mom said, running her hands through her hair in frustration. "The point is that you deliberately disobeyed me. You put yourself at risk. You interfered with a convicted criminal's parole." I wanted to tell her about the bullies, about how Marcus had never made me feel unsafe, about all the little things that suggested he was protecting rather than hunting. But I could see the fear in her eyes was real, and arguing would only make things worse. "Promise me," she said, gripping my shoulders. "Promise me you'll stay away from him. No more watching, no more questions, no more contact of any kind." I promised, but I couldn't stop thinking about what Marcus had said. He'd hurt someone, but not the way people thought. What did that mean? Late that Thursday night, I heard shouting from Marcus's yard. I peeked through my curtains and saw 3 men surrounding him on his front lawn. They were all bigger than Marcus, dressed in dark clothes, their faces twisted with anger. "We know what you did," one of them yelled, shoving Marcus backward. "We know why you were in prison, you sick freak. Kids aren't safe with you around," another shouted, pushing him from a different direction. Marcus stumbled but didn't fight back, didn't even raise his hands to defend himself. "Maybe we should take care of this problem ourselves," the third one said, and something about his tone made my blood run cold. Save the taxpayers some money. Marcus just stood there, hands at his sides, taking every insult and threat. He never raised his voice, never fought back, never even tried to defend himself. "I understand why you're angry," he said quietly, his voice calm despite being surrounded by 3 men who clearly wanted to hurt him. "I understand why you don't want me here." "Then leave," the first man spat. "Get out of our neighborhood before something bad happens to you." "We've got kids," another added. "We're not gonna stand by and let some child molester live next door to our families." That's when Marcus looked up, directly at my window. Our eyes met for just a second, and I saw something I didn't expect. Not guilt or anger or fear, just exhaustion, the kind of bone-deep tiredness that comes from carrying a burden for too long. "I've never hurt a child," he said, still looking at my window. "I never would." "Yeah, right," one of the men scoffed. "That's what they all say." The men eventually left, but not before making it clear they'd be watching him. I stayed at my window watching Marcus stand alone in his yard for nearly an hour. Finally, he went inside, and I saw his kitchen light stay on until dawn. The next morning, there was a note taped to our mailbox. In careful, neat handwriting, it read, "Check the news archives, March 15th, 2018, the real story." I waited until Mom left for her Saturday errands, then rode my bike to the public library downtown. The reference librarian, Mrs. Martinez, helped me access the newspaper archives on one of the computers. My hands shook as I typed in the date Marcus had specified. March 15th, 2018. There it was, buried on page 3 of the local section with a headline that made my heart stop. "Local man sentenced for assault on registered sex offender." My stomach dropped as I read the first paragraph. The article wasn't about Marcus being dangerous. It was about him being arrested for attacking someone else, someone who was the actual predator. According to the report, Marcus Torres had discovered that his neighbor, David Kellerman, was sexually abusing multiple children in their neighborhood. The article was sparse on details, but it painted a picture that was completely different from what everyone in our current neighborhood believed. Marcus had been living in a different part of town 3 years ago. He'd noticed strange patterns around Kellerman's house, children going in happy and coming out upset, parents dropping kids off for tutoring sessions that seemed to leave the children traumatized, a pattern of behavioral changes in neighborhood kids that concerned him. When police failed to act on Marcus's reports, he'd confronted Kellerman directly. The confrontation turned violent, and Marcus was arrested for assault and battery. But buried deeper in the article was a quote from Detective Sarah Mills that changed everything. While Mr. Torres's actions were legally wrong, his persistence in reporting suspected abuse likely prevented further victimization. Several children have since come forward with allegations against Mr. Kellerman, who is now facing multiple felony charges. I kept reading, my hands trembling as I scrolled through related articles. David Kellerman had been living in Marcus's old neighborhood for over a decade. He'd been a respected member of the community. He ran a youth group at the local community center, offered free babysitting services to struggling single parents, hosted sleepovers and camping trips for underprivileged children, all while systematically abusing them. The same pattern Marcus had recognized and tried to stop. I found follow-up articles from the weeks and months that followed. 17 children eventually came forward with testimony about abuse that had been happening for years. David Kellerman was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And Marcus Torres, the man who'd sacrificed his freedom to stop a monster, was labeled as a violent criminal by everyone who only heard part of the story. I printed every article I could find and stuffed them into my backpack. The more I read, the clearer the picture became. Marcus had been the first person to report David Kellerman to authorities. When his initial reports were dismissed as the complaints of a paranoid neighbor, he'd started documenting evidence. He'd taken photos of children leaving Kellerman's house looking upset, recorded license plates of parents who dropped kids off for tutoring sessions, even followed Kellerman to public places to document his interactions with children. For months, Marcus had tried to build a case through proper channels. He'd contacted police, Child Protective Services, the school district, even the FBI field office. Everyone told him the same thing. Suspicion wasn't evidence, and they needed more than one man's accusations to launch an investigation, so Marcus decided to get the evidence himself. According to court records I found in the library's legal database, Marcus had confronted Kellerman directly, demanding he stop abusing children. When Kellerman laughed and threatened to have Marcus arrested for harassment, something in Marcus snapped. The fight sent Kellerman to the hospital with 3 broken ribs, a concussion, and a shattered wrist. It sent Marcus to prison for 3 years on assault charges, but it also opened the floodgates for Kellerman's victims to come forward. Within weeks of Kellerman's hospitalization, children started telling their parents what had been happening during those tutoring sessions and camping trips. The investigation expanded rapidly as more victims were identified, more evidence was collected, more charges were filed. By the time Marcus was sentenced, David Kellerman was facing 17 counts of child sexual abuse, 43 counts of child pornography possession, and multiple counts of child endangerment. Marcus had been right about everything, and everyone had punished him for it. I sat in that library chair, staring at the computer screen, feeling sick about everything our neighborhood had gotten wrong. Every adult in our current community had failed to learn the truth about the man living among us. We'd branded him as a dangerous predator, while ignoring the fact that he'd actually sacrificed everything to protect children from a real monster. I gathered my printouts and rode home, my mind racing with questions and guilt. How many other people had gotten the story wrong? How many neighborhoods had Marcus been forced to leave because of false assumptions? How long had he been carrying the burden of being labeled as the very thing he'd fought against? When I got home, Mom was waiting in the kitchen, and I could tell from her expression that she knew I'd been somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. "Where were you?" she demanded, crossing her arms. Instead of making excuses, I spread the articles across our kitchen table and watched her face change as she read. Her hands started trembling by the second paragraph. "Oh my God," she whispered after finishing the first article. "We got it all wrong. We all got it completely wrong." She read every article twice, then sat down heavily in her chair like her legs couldn't support her anymore. "That man," she said, her voice breaking, "that man went to prison for trying to protect children, and we treated him like a monster." "Mom, there's more," I said, pulling out the articles about David Kellerman's sentencing. "Look at what he was trying to stop." As she read about the 17 victims, about years of systematic abuse, about a predator who'd used community trust to access vulnerable children, I watched my mother's worldview crack and reshape itself. "How did we get it so wrong?" she asked, tears starting to fall. "How did we completely miss the truth?" "Because everyone only heard part of the story," I said, and the part they heard made Marcus sound like the bad guy. That evening, Mom did something I'd never seen her do before. She walked across the yard and knocked on Marcus's door. I watched from the window as she handed him the printed articles and spoke quietly for several minutes. Marcus listened without interrupting, nodded a few times, then gently closed the door. When she came back inside, her eyes were red from crying. "What did you say to him?" I asked. "I apologized," she said simply. "And I told him I was ashamed of how we'd treated him." "What did he say?" "That he understood why we were scared. That he didn't blame us for wanting to protect our children." The next few days were chaos in our neighborhood. Mom started calling other parents, sharing what we'd learned. Some refused to believe it. Surely the newspapers had gotten it wrong. Surely there was more to the story. But others began to have the same doubts I'd experienced, the same nagging feeling that something hadn't added up. Mrs. Henderson was the hardest to convince. She'd been the most vocal about wanting Marcus removed from the neighborhood, had organized the safety patrols and emergency homeowners meetings. "This is all very convenient," she said when Mom showed her the articles. "How do we know these aren't fake? How do we know he didn't plant them somehow?" But when Pastor Williams confirmed the story by calling his contacts in Marcus's former neighborhood, even Mrs. Henderson had to accept the truth. Within a week, police cars appeared on our street. Not to arrest Marcus, but to investigate the house 2 doors down from ours. David Kellerman's old house, where Dr. Richard Brennan now lived. The same Dr. B. Brennan who'd moved into the neighborhood 2 years earlier, shortly after Marcus's release from prison. The same Dr. Brennan who'd positioned himself as a child safety expert, hosting community workshops about protecting children from predators. The same Dr. Brennan who'd started an after-school tutoring program that met at his house twice a week. The same Dr. Brennan who'd volunteered to counsel children who'd been traumatized by news of the Kellerman case. And the same Dr. Brennan who'd been corresponding with David Kellerman in prison, continuing the work his mentor had started. When police raided Dr. Brennan's house, they found evidence that made even hardened investigators sick. Hundreds of images and videos. Documentation of ongoing abuse involving at least 12 children from our neighborhood, including my friend Jenny, who'd been tutoring there twice a week for the past year. That's when everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Marcus hadn't just been avoiding children to protect himself from false accusations. He'd been watching Dr. Brennan. All those times I'd seen him looking toward that house. All those strategic positions in his garden. All those careful routines. He'd been gathering evidence, again, but this time, he'd been smarter about it. This time, he'd learned from his mistakes. Instead of confronting the predator directly, he'd been documenting everything, building an airtight case, waiting for the right moment to present evidence that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. The manila envelope Detective Mills collected from Marcus contained 3 years of careful documentation. Photos taken with a telephoto lens showing children entering and leaving Dr. Brennan's house, license plate numbers of parents who dropped kids off for tutoring, behavioral observations of children before and after their sessions, even recordings of conversations between Dr. Brennan and David Kellerman, made during prison visits that Marcus had somehow documented. He's been working on this case for 3 years, Detective Mills told the gathered crowd of parents and reporters. Mr. Torres provided the key evidence that allowed us to build a prosecution case. The night Dr. Brennan was arrested, I found Marcus standing in his backyard, staring at the police cars surrounding the house 2 doors down. I walked over, ignoring Mom's worried calls from our porch. "You knew," I said. "This whole time, you knew he was hurting kids." Marcus looked at me with those same tired eyes I'd been seeing for months. I suspected from the day he moved in. Kellerman had mentioned him in letters. I knew he was coming. "Why didn't you report him immediately?" "I did. Multiple times. But I'm a convicted felon reporting on a respected psychiatrist. Who do you think they believed?" The weight of his words hit me like a physical blow. He'd been trying to protect us for 3 years, and no one had listened because of his criminal record. "So you just watched?" "I watched. I documented. I gathered evidence that couldn't be dismissed. And I tried to keep kids safe without being able to save them." His voice cracked slightly. "Do you have any idea what that's like? Knowing children are being hurt and being powerless to stop it immediately?" Detective Mills approached us, her expression respectful. "Mr. Torres, we're going to need your full statement, and we'll need to go through all your documentation." Marcus nodded and handed her a thick manila envelope. "Everything's organized by date. Photos, behavioral observations, correspondence records, even financial transactions that seemed suspicious." "This is incredible work," Detective Mills said, flipping through the materials. "You basically did our job for us." "I had 3 years of practice," Marcus replied quietly. Over the following weeks, our neighborhood transformed completely. Parents who had crossed the street to avoid Marcus now brought him home-baked goods and tearful apologies. Children who'd been taught to fear him learned he'd been the guardian angel they never knew they had. Mrs. Henderson organized what she called an apology campaign, neighbors taking turns visiting Marcus to express their regret for how they'd treated him. She was the first in line. "I ruined your life," she sobbed on his front porch. "I organized the whole neighborhood against you. I made everyone afraid. You were protecting your grandchildren," Marcus told her gently. "I can't fault you for that." But Marcus never showed anger or bitterness, even when people offered elaborate apologies and explanations. When neighbors tried to organize a fundraiser to help him, he declined. When they offered public recognition, he refused. When the local news wanted to do a story about the man who'd solved the case, he said no interviews. "I didn't do this for recognition," he told the reporter who kept calling. "I did it because children deserve to be safe." The community tried everything to make amends. The Homeowners Association voted to give him a special recognition award. The city council wanted to present him with a key to the city. Parents offered to pay for home improvements, car repairs, anything he needed. Marcus politely refused everything. "I don't need recognition," he told Mom when she asked what the neighborhood could do to make up for their treatment. "I just need to know kids are safe." 3 months after Dr. Brennan's arrest, Marcus put his house up for sale. Not because of continued harassment, that had stopped completely. Not because people still feared him, they'd moved to the opposite extreme of treating him like a hero. But because he'd finally found something he'd been searching for since his release from prison 3 years earlier: peace. He'd spent years carrying the burden of being labeled as the very thing he'd fought against. He'd endured harassment, isolation, and constant suspicion while quietly working to protect the children who feared him. Now, finally, the truth was known. The real monster had been caught. The neighborhood was safe. His work was done. The day before he moved out, Marcus left me a note. "Emma, thank you for being brave enough to look for the truth when all the adults around you had stopped trying. You saw things they missed, asked questions they were afraid to ask, and refused to accept easy answers to complicated questions. Keep questioning what people tell you, especially when something doesn't feel right. The most important truths are often the ones that make people uncomfortable. You have good instincts. Trust them. Don't let anyone convince you to ignore what you see with your own eyes or feel in your gut. And remember that the people who seem dangerous aren't always the ones you need to fear. Sometimes they're the ones trying to save you. Stay safe, stay curious, and don't let anyone convince you to stop asking difficult questions." Marcus P.S. I left something for you in the garden, behind the sunflowers. I found a small metal lockbox buried where he'd indicated. Inside was a key and a note. "For your bike lock. Kids should be able to ride safely without worrying about bullies or worse." There was also a photograph. Marcus in military uniform, much younger, standing with a group of soldiers in front of what looked like a Middle Eastern building. On the back, he'd written, "Afghanistan, 2009. Military police. Sometimes protecting people means making sacrifices others don't understand." I learned later that Marcus had been a military police officer overseas, specializing in investigating abuse cases involving contractors and local officials. He'd been decorated twice for his work protecting civilians, including children in war zones. He'd basically been doing the same job his entire adult life, protecting vulnerable people from predators. The house where Dr. Brennan had lived was torn down within 6 months, the property deemed too contaminated by what had happened there. In its place, the city built a small park with a playground and a community garden. There's a bench near the swings with a small plaque that reads, "In memory of courage, for those who speak up when no one wants to listen." I sit on that bench sometimes and think about Marcus, about how he'd spent 3 years in prison and another 3 years in neighborhood exile, all for trying to protect children. About how many kids might have been saved if we'd listened to him from the beginning instead of believing assumptions and gossip. About how he'd continued protecting us even when everyone thought he was the danger. Now I'm 25, working as a social worker specializing in child protection cases. My colleagues all know the story of Marcus Torres, how a man everyone feared turned out to be the guardian angel our neighborhood desperately needed. It's changed how I approach every case, how I listen to every report, how I investigate every claim. I've learned to look beyond surface accusations and dig for the whole truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable or complicated. I've also learned to pay attention to the people others dismiss, the witnesses deemed unreliable because of their criminal records, the reporters whose past makes people uncomfortable, the advocates who ask difficult questions that make institutions defensive. Because sometimes the person everyone warns you about is the only one telling the truth. Sometimes the real monster is hiding behind community respect, professional credentials, and a friendly smile. And sometimes protection comes from the most unlikely places, from someone who's already lost everything but still refuses to stop caring. Marcus taught me that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what's right even when the world punishes you for it, even when no one believes you, even when helping others costs you everything. Last month, I got a letter with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping about a child trafficking ring that had been exposed in another state, and a note in familiar handwriting. Some fights never end, but they're always worth fighting. Stay safe, keep asking questions. A friend. I don't know if Marcus was involved in that investigation, but I hope he was. I hope he's somewhere out there, still watching out for kids who need protecting, still making sacrifices that others will never understand or appreciate, because the world needs more people like Marcus Torres. People who see danger others miss. People who act when institutions fail. People who sacrifice their reputation, their freedom, even their safety to protect the innocent. People who understand that sometimes being the person everyone warns you about is exactly what you need to be.